Hello, my name is Ejaz Hussain, and I am so glad to be able to speak to you today. And I thank USP for this kind invitation. I wish I could be with you in person to share my thoughts on quality by design. My background is I'm a pharmacist, and currently I am also the president of the National Institute of Pharmaceutical Technology and Education, which is a collaboration among 17 American universities. And I also have a consulting company, Insight Advice and Solution. The USP International Conference is seeking to share new perspectives in advancing with quality of medicine, a 360-degree view. How do I provide a 360-degree view to you? Let me share my different views that I have had on the topic of quality by design. I've been a professor in academia at University of Cincinnati and Ohio Northern University. I was a regulator at FDA, and I had the privilege to champion the FDA's PAT and pharmaceutical quality for the 21st century initiatives, which led to the ICHQ8 and other guideline. After leaving FDA, I led the Sandoz biosimilar program development and was able to launch for them the first three biosimilars, first three biosimilars in the globe, and also two complex generics, generic enoxaparin and generic Copaxone applications were submitted before I had left Sandoz. I also worked for a tobacco industry, looking at tobacco harm reduction and also on making vaccines in tobacco plant before coming back to pharma and working for a year in an Indian company, and before starting my own consulting company in 2013 and rejoining academia on a part-time basis with the National Institute for Pharmaceutical Technology and Education. So I've been thinking about quality by design literally most of my career. And I will be able to share my views from many different perspectives, and hopefully, this will meet the criteria of a 360-degree view. The nation is hurting today, and I think we are very concerned. And we are really engaged together with FDA, with USP, and others. And when I say we, I'm referring to the National Institute for Pharmaceutical Technology and Education. As an example, 91 people die from an opioid-related overdose on an average day in America. And the cost of prescription drugs have double, triple, in some cases, 1,000% increased. And in recent years, shortages of all sort of drugs have plagued the U.S. Supply of medicines. And these are very serious concerns, and we need to find solutions. And this is a problem of the system, and a system consists of many parts, and we need to work together to find the solutions. Over the past several years, there have been therapeutic failures, several of those. This is just one example. And the challenge we also face is today a number of warning letters, particularly starting with India and China. But today, the largest number of the largest growing of warning letters for breaches in assurance of data integrity or bad eye are in US. So breaches in assurance of data integrity is a global challenge. And I have had a chance to think about this with my consulting efforts in India and trying to understand what are the causes for breaches in assurance of data integrity and other deviation. My answer really is very clear to me. Our complexity, the complexity of our products and of our materials has increased to such an extent that we have uh, starting to realize with biosimilars and complex generics that pharmaceutical equivalence is a major challenge. And the complexity of pharmaceutical equivalence is something we have to confront. I think over the past several decades, we have done well to improve our bioequivalence assessment, but I think we have not paid enough attention to how do we assess pharmaceutical equivalence. In the legal and regulatory aspect, a tablet is a tablet, a capsule is a capsule. That has been the old way of thinking about pharmaceutical equivalence. But with the increasing complexity of materials, of products, and of performance attributes that relate to the product physical attributes and other attributes, we have to pay attention to addressing pharmaceutical equivalence in a much more sophisticated way that we have done before. The complexity of dosage forms has increased, but our manufacturing processes have been the traditional manufacturing processes of making tablets and capsules and other things. And the number of failures, deviations out of specification results that we get has increased significantly. In fact, early in 2001, when we started the PAT initiative at the US FDA, it was very clear that the efficiency of pharmaceutical manufacturing at the larger companies such as Pfizer and so forth was hurting because of a significant amount of time was being devoted to deviation investigations, and often the root cause is unknown. A lot of time is lost and a lot of batches are rejected for no other reason because we could not find a root cause. I think what happened then was quite a bit of manufacturing went overseas. Today in US, over 40% of the medicines available on the market come from India. Most of them API comes from China, and the manufacturing that went to overseas. What we did not realize, I'm talking about FDA, that the regulatory inspection scheme that we have in the US, pre-approval inspection coupled with periodic every 2 years inspections would be unannounced, and surprise inspections. A lot of those methodologies and rigor for inspection could not be brought to bear in India and China because of travel, because of visa, because of many, many other issues. And therefore, I think what we fail to realize that the empowerment of people on the front lines in India and China is very different than in America. The fear of OS and that triggers, and the cost of rejecting a batch which is unheard of, and all those reasons became a reason to have breaches in assurance of data integrity. So the question, I think, really is, uh, uh, what are the consequences? What are the consequences of breaches in assurance of data integrity? FDA has done a lot of testing of the samples from India and China, but we don't find some failures. But the challenge is when we look at the types of reasons for recall. This is for the year 2012, when 2008 to 12. You look at impurities degradation products are the ones. So no class 1 recall. Class 1 recall would be where there was a serious consequence to the patient, but class 2 and class 3 recalls for impurities and degradants, and failed dissolution, one class 1 recall, which the example I showed you, I think, earlier, and several class 2 recalls, and so forth and so forth. So but these, in with the breaches in assurance of data integrity, this is a very incomplete data because a lot of such data have not been submitted. So the concern is very high that we are seeing significant numbers of recalls and we have breaches in assurance of data integrity. So we really don't know the true extent of recalls and what harm they may be causing to the patients, because our pharmacovigilance obviously is a very blunt instrument, and the whole idea of quality by design is to prevent from failures from occurring, and therefore the efforts that we have are not working. Now, given the point I made that the nation is hurting, I think what has also occurred is the placebo and nocebo effects have dramatically increased in America. These effects are being seen in new clinical studies, but also what we often forget is when we approve a new drug, we have in many cases placebo-controlled, double-blind placebo-controlled clinical studies. Does the placebo effect disappear because of that? No, the placebo effect remains, but we often don't think about that in our practices. And what has occurred is the number of negative media reports starting from the consent decree, the warning letters, and constant bombardment of failures after the heparin tragedy that occurred in 2007. The fear and other aspects have become so significant that uh, the impact of placebo and nocebo effects is now being seen in daily practice, and even you can see expectations effect of price as a proxy for efficacy is visible in controlled studies uh, that have been published. And variation in pill appearance and can be linked to adherence, non-adherence. So the FDA had to issue a guideline in 2015 saying that size, shape, and other physical attributes of generic tablets and capsules matter. So pharmaceutical equivalence has become so prominent that not only for complex generics in terms of pharmaceutical equivalence in a different sense, but even perception are so important today. So I think this is a very serious situation, and we have to work together on this. So when you look at this problem, clearly we are struggling because we have increased complexity and uncertainty, and we haven't stepped up to address these in terms of a number of scientific approaches that need to be brought to bear. But we also have not prepared our professionals to be able to handle this increased complexity and uncertainty. So I think here I pose a question. There is increased placebo and nocebo effect. We know pharmaceutical equivalence has become such a dominant question. We have a global supply. We have increasing number of warning letters and so forth. What is the cause and what is the effect? I think that is not as easy to find out. And I think that's the dilemma that we have often to deal with. So today, using the media reports over the last couple of months, July and August here, what is the current state of the engine of affordability in the US? This is the generic sector. Bloomberg reported in July that US generic drug market in chaos. Indian upstarts rise. So the second layer of Indian companies are getting more approvals, whereas the first layer, the larger companies, have been struggling with their GMP remediation. Generic prices increased. Market is small and in many for drugs, and we have monopoly and duopoly. So there are not many manufacturers. Now FDA is seeking to boost generic approval so that consumers will lower their cost. But we want to maintain FDA's gold standard of rigorous science-based regulation. So how do we accomplish all of this? I think a recent publication by Lawrence Yu and Michael Kopcha. Michael Kopcha is the director of Office of Pharmaceutical Quality at FDA CEDAR, and Lawrence Yu is the deputy director of that office. They wrote a very thoughtful paper. And FDA is now reviving pharmaceutical quality for the 21st century, and it's calling it 2.0. And they essentially have outlined in this paper the future of pharmaceutical quality is Six Sigma. That is a very low rate of error of 3.4 defect per million opportunities. And FDA has outlined their intention to create a path to get there is to create economic drivers, performance-based regulations, clearly quality by design and advanced manufacturing technologies, continuous improvement and operational excellence. So those are the key areas that FDA is focused on, and FDA recognizes that Six Sigma 3.4 DPM levels are rarely seen in pharmaceutical sector, but there are a handful of companies such as Amgen and others which have really progressed to be Six Sigma. So I think we have a number of factors that will play in and how this how the next set of strategies from FDA will evolve. And in that paper, it is also important to note that class 1 drug product recalls have been going up since the year 2007 onwards. And the number of other recalls, class 2 and class 3, is large number. And as I said earlier, that given the breaches in assurance of data integrity, this is a very small number. The true extent of recalls and true extent of failures is unknown. So this is simply a snapshot of what is reported. So the strategy in the US is very clear going forward. Promote real-time controls and automation, continuous manufacturing. And I think Ding will talk to you about that and how USP is also engaged in helping in that effort. Clearly, I think FDA wants to bring a risk-based regulatory oversight. And in here, they have brought together a new Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, a team approach to review, and they're building team-based approaches to sharing information with a new cadre of inspectors which will be formed under the alignment program that they have, and they are seeking to establish quality metrics. And in November of 2016, FDA issued the second draft guideline on quality metrics, which includes failure rates, patient complaints, and invalidated out of specification rate as the three metrics FDA is seeking to get from industry. Clearly, I think, as I earlier mentioned, economic drivers and performance-based regulations are going to evolve, and this will be a very interesting dynamic that will be created. So, for example, as I mentioned to you earlier, in one of the FDA presentations, Amgen is listed as a company which is approaching or is at Six Sigma. I have recently evaluated Amgen's example, and if you go on my LinkedIn page, you will see that how did they approach and how did they achieve Six Sigma using ICH-Q10 guideline as a framework is very impressive. Now, the economic driver means that Amgen, and if I use 3 Sigma 3.4 DPM as a performance standard for the effectiveness of pharmaceutical quality system at Amgen, that they economic driver would mean that they should be able to claim, publicize that information to the public would be one way of creating an economic driver. The other part of the economic driver would be is Amgen would not have more significant the number of inspections, the number or the type of oversight FDA puts on Amgen should be different. So these are some of the questions that will unfold in the coming years on how economic drivers and performance-based regulations will evolve. And clearly, I think yeah, when you look at the collective picture, continuous manufacturing, real-time controls that FDA is promoting is really a way to say this is a means of getting higher assurance of quality. And it is a renaissance for many of the manufacturers to focus on new technologies for manufacturing more efficiently in a more automated way, and with advantages of less footprint, smaller wastages, less environmental impact, and all other reasons to bring manufacturing back to US. And I think that would be the way that strategy is likely to unfold. So, to summarize the current trends, we have significantly increasing uncertainty and complexity, and US FDA has reorganized its Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, and it is seeking alignment between CMC review and GMP functions. It has brought in a team approach to review now. It is focusing on building surveillance programs and other things, but above all, it is trying to achieve one quality voice. And this is a significant challenge to achieve one quality voice. And I'll talk to you about that a bit more shortly. Clearly, as we have seen, generic drug sector is in trouble, and there are many other challenges from abuse, need for opioid to address opioid addiction, to a number of different challenges. So, in that sense, I wanted to share some thoughts on what can academia, and here I'm using the National Institute for Pharmaceutical Technology and Education as an example, and the compendia as USP do to help in this regard. What can we do independently, and what can we do together? These are some important questions we have just started to ask between USP and NIPT at the moment. A few weeks ago, we got together and focused our discussion on rethinking how we educate, train, and evaluate the experience of pharmaceutical professionals in the context of the need to achieve the elusive one quality voice. Was really a topic of extensive and very exciting discussion between USP and NIPT faculty that occurred at the USP's beautiful facilities in Rockville, Maryland. So the point I think I want to make here is we are struggling to practice the principles outlined in established regulatory guidelines. I will, as an example, illustrate ICH Q8, Q9, Q10 as a core set of guidelines which are to usher in at a international level quality by design. But FDA's PAT guidance, process validation guidelines, are really a key component of this entire picture. And clearly, we have to link back to the older ICH guidelines of ICH Q6A and all other guidelines, because we do have a set of guidelines, but they have been developed over a period of time, and we have a tendency to look at each of them in isolation. We struggle because we are unable to integrate and align the information and principles across many of these guidelines, and therefore we don't see the big picture, and we tend to be so narrowly focused it becomes check the box exercise for each of those guidelines. That is not systems thinking. To have a true appreciation of a system, as in ICHQ10, we have to be able to look at the big picture and align the principles and information throughout these guidelines, and we struggle to do that often. So, in, particularly in case of ICHQ8 and quality by design, we're struggling to do what? So when I look at quality by design, we are starting with quality target product profile, QTPP. We have we need to know how the process will flow. We have a plan. We need to have risk assessment. We need to identify critical quality attributes. We need to know what are the critical process parameters, critical material attributes. We need to think about what's the design space, what's our control strategy. And if I bring in the FDA's process validation guideline 2011, you have a life cycle approach to process validation. So you have phase one is the end of development process control, and then you have process qualification, and then you go into continued process verification. So when I look at a typical generic drug development process, we FDA had spent time to build a question-based review and put two examples on their website in collaboration with Generic Pharmaceutical Association. But when I look at that entire picture, we're still struggling because of the following. One, when we look at the quality target product profile, we go to the very high level. We aim at the compendial requirements. Compendial requirements are the minimal standards. When tested, you have to meet those requirements, but during development, you must aim high. And you have to aim high, and we are not doing that. And with respect to process flow, we particularly in the generic, we don't see the big picture. If you look at the submission and Dr. Woodcock's testimony to the US Congress, we go through multiple review cycles. So the old idea of file first and figure it out later continues. And our risk literacy is very poor. Patient and process related failure modes has become a new concept. FDA reviewers are now more focused on asking these questions on patient and process related failure modes during the CMC review process. But most generic companies that I know are struggling to do this, and therefore the number of cycles of review cycles needed to approve an ANDA is 4, 5, 7 usually, and if it is a complex generics, it takes about 6, 7, 8 years to approve a generic. So we are struggling in this regard. I think CQAs, we are focused on the compendial monographs and not necessarily understanding what are the critical quality attributes of the reference product, and especially in the context of pharmaceutical equivalence, what is the variability in the reference product. We don't test enough lots of reference product to understand the failure modes and other things. And the compendial monographs are the foundation, but when the development, you have to aim higher, and if you keep aiming at the target, you will miss it, and that's what keeps happening. And when it comes to critical process parameters, we use the default 10x scale up and so forth, and don't ask the question, is this 10x applicable to my complex formulation of a product, and so forth. And we just go with the blindly 10x, and we forget the important role of physical attributes, excipient functionality, material functionality in how it relates to not only processability, but also as it relates to the patient-related failure modes. And I think what I see often in India is there's a lot of excitement about design of experiment software, and people purchase the software but have no understanding of how to use it. They'll run a design of experiment and say we have a design space. We forget to ask the key questions, what the design space should be. And as a result, I think when we are not focused on critical process parameters, critical material attributes in a very structured way, the entire control strategy and process qualification and continued process verification has weaknesses. And we don't leverage the biobatch and the exhibit batches in a way to derive maximal information about variability and how that variability might relate to the bioavailability or bioequivalence consideration, and we lose much of this opportunity. So the sector in general is struggling to get a handle on variability, and as well as the prior knowledge that they need to leverage, and they don't generate sufficient prior knowledge to do this right. One quality voice is important, and I think an FDA is going through this process. When I was at FDA, having the review staff and the inspection staff work together is a very important consideration. And when we were building the PAT team in the year 2000, bringing the review and CGMP inspection staff to work together was not easy. As you can see in the first picture, when I started to build the team, they were really not happy to be in the same room, and I needed to make them dance together for them to work together. But also, I think what we had done there is to educate, train, and certify the PAT team as a unit. So each reviewer, part of the PAT team, and inspector as part of the PAT team worked as a team and were educated, trained, and certified as a team. And that was very important. In many aspects, now FDA is trying to do that again. In the year 2004, the idea of this team to be scaled up to the entire FDA system was not an acceptable idea, and therefore I think that didn't continue. But now everybody has realized that this is important, and they bring in that concept back today under one quality voice. So what I wanted to share with you now is I think cross-functional quality by design education is essential, and NIPT um, recently conducted a training cross-functional quality by design education program for Sun Pharma in India. And we spent a lot of time really bringing cross-functional team from R&D, regulatory, quality, operations, quality control, all to be together to understand what quality by design means and how they go from, say, ICHQ 6A to I to each of those guidelines for generics, but also to ICHQ 10, including process validation and so forth. So because in a typical company, the regulatory folks will look at this guidelines, quality folks will look at that guideline. This is my area, that's my area. They don't connect the dots. So we developed a program to have a cross-functional quality by design education with case example. So for example, the case example I'm sharing here is a real case example from an FDA complete response letter. This is from the new review process that FDA has. So FDA says, we find the formulation and process is neither optimized nor robust based on the batch to batch variability in batch yield, person rejects, and dissolution data using the development data and exhibit batch manufacturer details. Given the complexity of the manufacturing process and the formulation and the process related efficiency, we suggest you either maintain the commercial batch size same as exhibit batch or demonstrate feasibility of commercial scale. So what you're seeing here is the review has becoming more scientific, more focused on process control, more focused on failure mode, and more rigorous risk assessment. And the default, like the 10x we had for scale up, is no longer accepted without justification. So I think you're seeing the changes in FDA, but the industry has to be prepared for this. And I think an education program that brings in case examples is extremely important. Clearly, I think process validation, especially the process validation guideline, you will have a separate talk on that. So I'm not going to give you that, but I just wanted to remind us that roadmap to process capability is first is challenge the spec. And I think I canceled that out because this was after the fact. But I think how we set specification is a very important consideration, and how do we justify the specification is clear. And if you the key is you have to aim higher. You cannot simply cut and paste USP monograph which applies only for the sample and apply that to a batch. And so you have to aim higher for that. So measurement system capability for all CQAs is important. important. Now, you can't get to process capability without asking the question, is your measurement system capable? And when it comes to physical attributes such as particle size, dissolution, cascade impactor, and all of these things, our validation criteria for analytical methods is weak. And what we have done is we have applied the validation criteria that we use for HPLC, a solution. When we have a stock solution, one injection is the same as the next injection, so we don't have any worry about that. But in the physical domain, each sample that we have is a distinct sample. So therefore, calibration is often not sufficient. You have to think about reproducibility and repeatability over the life cycle of this product. And so you cannot get to process capability without asking the question, has the measurement system capability been verified? If you can't, you have to stop. And that really is a stumbling block in many cases. Then we have to ask the question, is the process stable for all CQAs? And what can we do to address special cause? Do we know the difference between special cause and common cause? Then we ask this question, are the processes capable? And clearly, I think, what is the link between CQAs, PPPs, and what are the CPPs, and what are the range for controlling, all have to be brought together. And if you look at the traditional or older ANDA, much of this information is not available. And therefore, there's so much work to be done to really boost this. Our approach to training at the Sun Pharma example was to really bring together the multiple functions and the gaps that exist. So the time, cost, and complexity pressures keeps the different functions quite separated from the goal of quality by design. R&D, product and process, regulatory, each one of them have a very different set of objectives. And in the time, cost, and complexity pressure, we can't take a systems perspective, and we don't understand the big picture. So the key to training was to make sure that every function understands what is quality by design, and how do you translate that to continued process verification, and what does it mean to do this in an effective pharmaceutical quality system. So you're looking at Q8, Q9, process validation, and the Q10 all coming together, and all people have to be trained on this. And I think the key here is this. I think the human factor is very, very important in with pressure, with time pressure, with stress and rush to file. We underappreciate complexity, and we often find ourselves in over our head. So I have done a lot of culture of quality training in India, and I had to sort of build together is, how do we address the human behavior aspect? And what is very clear to me is adult human development occurs in stages. Some adults develop, but at different rates, but many do not. And this development is the maturity. So we cannot just think about technical education. We have to think about adaptive learning, and the knowledge we gain from adaptive experience is not of the same quality. And I think we have too many blind spots and so forth. So one of the key is systems orientation is an adult human development stage, according to Professor Keegan at Harvard, under the constructive development theory. And much of for example, India is one of the youngest country in the world now, and therefore systems orientation is very difficult to achieve in those organizations. Plus, but from a behavioral economics, I think we tend to make decisions based on our intuition, and most of our decision is not thoughtful decisions, but a reaction. So we think fast and automatic thinking, and we make a lot of mistakes that way. So I think in terms of systems orientation and all this education, we have to bring all of these pieces together, because real-time documentation and assurance of data integrity, attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate, really demands that we have sufficient time, sufficient understanding, sufficient uh, uh, flexibility in terms of not having pressure to do things right. And today, in a rush to market, rush to do everything, and our attention span has gone down so much, the human factor is one of the key things that we have to consider. And education with certification, meaningful certification, is the need of the hour. So let me summarize. A nation is hurting. Meeting the needs of the patients is our responsibility. As academics under the National Institute for Pharmaceutical Technology and Education, much of our work is supported by US FDA. We are looking for collaboration with USP and other collaborators to really find ways that we can help meet the needs of the patients. Education and with certification in the context of effective quality by design to continued process verification within an effective pharmaceutical quality system is the need of the hour. Our traditional education programs in schools of pharmacy and so forth do not address this at all. And all the people who are working in the sector needs this education with certification to connect the dots, to see the big picture, to put the entire picture together. And this is an urgent issue, and we are working hard to do this. And USFDA has requested NIPT to do the same thing for the review staff, and we are in the process of working and developing those modules right now. The other need of the hour is new prior knowledge. I think the complexity has increased so much, and many of the CQAs are physical attributes, and our measurement systems are in need for improvement. And at the same time, I think you need to have assessment of lot-to-lot variability of the RLD to gauge what is critical and what variability is acceptable. But the traditional generic model is not designed for testing large number of lots. I remember when I was with Sandoz and we were developing generic enoxaparin, we tested 57 lots to understand the variability of the RLD, and so that we are within that variability. Most generic companies cannot afford to do that, and therefore there is an urgent need for a third party such as NIPT to be able to bring a set of orthogonal analytical technologies, modern technologies, to assess the RLD, look at the variability, understand what the failure modes are, what are the process related failure modes, and consolidate that as a monograph, which could be quality target product profile monograph in a more detailed way, and make it available to the generic companies, so that not each of generic companies has to do that. That would be waste of time and effort. And can NIPT and USP work together? That can this become a general chapter in USP? Those are the topics we are discussing today. We don't have a conclusion yet, but we are progressing in that thought process. So at NIPT, we're doing several research projects, how to build a quality scorecard for FDA, abuse deterrence, excipient knowledge base, how do you establish clinical relevance, and we are sort of bringing and filling the gaps in knowledge that exist within the sector. And really the aim here is to make quality by design normal, easy, and rewarding. And that, we believe, would be a significant contribution to address the availability, affordability, and assurance that patients need in America and all across the globe. And I think we look forward to pursuing this goal with a passion, and we would welcome to work with anybody who's willing to work with us. Thank you for listening, and I wish I could be with you in person. My apologies for that, but I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Thank you.